This video is the last little bit of a series of videos on the prophecies of Daniel about the year when Jesus would die and about the exact day when he will return. If you haven't done so already, please go through the first two videos, which are on your screen now. Watch them through, and when you feel you understand them, come back here for a line-by-line interpretation of a chart, which appears in the second video, showing the exact number of days between certain events that lead up to and immediately follow on from the return of Jesus. What you will have learned in the video on the last 7 years is that there is a final period of 7 years before the return of Jesus, during which specific important events will take place. And these events will help us to count down to the day when Jesus will return. In each video, we've tried to remind people that the word for 7 years in Hebrew is week, the same as the word we use for 7 days. So 70 weeks is actually 70 7-year periods, or 490 years, just to clarify that. Only the King James Version still uses the old word week. The part of the prophecy covered in the first video, that is, the first 69 of the 70 7-year weeks, is very clear and precise. But as you move through the series, you'll notice that there's gradually more room for error or disagreement about precisely what each verse is saying. What makes Bible prophecy so complex is that you have to build up various pieces into a coherent whole, and so a mistake in the first few steps could end up being miles off later on. For that reason, we put a lot of effort into getting this core prophecy right, especially at the start of it. By core prophecy, I mean the one this whole series is dealing with, the 70 weeks prophecy, as it's called. Here, at the end of that prophecy, we start to see how all of this fits together with many other prophecies that have not even been mentioned up to this point. The encouraging thing is that it does fit so neatly with so many other prophecies. So I'm going to try to get this last little bit as clear as possible too, because it's something that interests a lot of people. The fact that it can eventually be used to pinpoint the exact day when Jesus will return makes it kind of a future version of the part that predicted his first coming, and which led to so many Jews expecting him at that time. Okay, so let's go straight to the chart, the one which only appears momentarily in the second video. I'm now going to try to explain it line by line. We start with 7 years, that is, the last 7 years of Daniel's 490-year prophecy about what was needed and what is still needed before the redemption of the human race will be finished. But first, one little disclaimer. Those last 7 years are about a month short of what we would call 7 years by today's Gregorian calendars. And that's because the calendar used in Bible prophecies was based on the Babylonian year. Babylonian calendars used 12 equal months of 30 days each, or a total of 360 days for 1 year. Now that's 5¼ days short of a year within our Gregorian calendars. There's a line in Matthew 24, verse 22, which says, "Except those days should be shortened," and it's talking about the terrible trouble that comes in the middle of the last 7 years. "Except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened." Now this could be referring to the shortened year in Babylonian calendars, because Christians will literally be counting down every day at the end, because we'll be suffering more than at any other time in history. So shortening the 7 years by even 1 month could be a great relief for those of us who are still alive at the end. Anyway, the shorter Babylonian year is why we have the number of days shown here in the first line on the chart as 2,520 days. That's what you get by multiplying 84 months, that is 7 years times 12 months, multiplying that 84 by 30 days. You get 2,520 days. This period of 7 years is described in the 70 years prophecy in Daniel 9:27, where it says, "He shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week." Remember, that's 7 years. "And in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations, he will make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined, shall be poured upon the desolate." There are 3 significant events referred to here, so let's look at them more closely. These last 7 years stretch from something called confirming the covenant, over here on the left, through some horrible abomination that results in the sacrifices ceasing somewhere near the middle of the last 7 years, and up to something called the consummation, being poured on the desolate, over here on the right. The word consummation just means the end. It is significant that it is also used to refer to the start of a marriage. It is significant because the other event linked to the return of Jesus and the pouring out of God's wrath on the earth is called the marriage supper of the Lamb. So it's the end of the old and the start of the new. This marriage supper is something very spiritual that happens up in the sky where Jesus is married to his true followers inside a structure referred to as the New Jerusalem. Do you see how all these other aspects of prophecy are popping up and coming together here? Pouring consummation on the desolate seems to be a phrase that refers to the end or consummation of God's patience, when he literally pours out his wrath on all those people who have rejected him. In the Revelation, chapter 16, this is described as God pouring out 7 bowls or 7 vials of his fierce anger on a disobedient and rebellious world. In the middle of all this, it says that for the overspreading of abominations, he, presumably the Antichrist, shall make it, presumably the temple, desolate. Now, Jesus specifically urged his followers to understand what this abomination of desolation was all about, because he said it was a very significant pointer to when he would return. So that's the sequence of events during the final 7 years before Jesus returns. The actual figure of 2,520 days does not appear in the Bible, but the figure for half of the last 7 years is repeated in several places, and it is given as 3.5 years, 42 months, or 1,260 days. I've just doubled that here to give you the total number of days in all of the last 7 years. But there's another figure which pops up in the 8th chapter of Daniel, verse 13, which is much closer to 2,520 days. This figure, 2,300 days, represents the amount of time between when animal sacrifices start in Jerusalem through the abomination of desolation in the temple until finally this horribly desecrated temple is cleansed. The key word desolate or desolation appears in both passages, Daniel 9:27 and Daniel 8:13. What we're going to assume here is that when God's wrath is poured on the desolate people and on the desolate temple, that is when the sanctuary is cleansed. So, when you line up the 2 periods of time with both of them finishing at the same time, that is, when God starts to pour out his wrath on the desolate people, thus cleansing the temple, you get a discrepancy of 220 days, or a bit over 7 months over here at the start. Now this may be a good place to show how there's still some uncertainty with these figures. If the period of 2,300 days extends to the end of the wrath, it could shift over to the right here by some 45 days, which I'll explain in a moment. But either way, the difference in the starting point is important. It could be 220 days, or it could be 265 days, depending on whether we're talking about the start or the finish of the wrath over here on the right. So, what is the difference between the 2 starting points? One for the 7-year timeline, and the other, which is 220 or possibly 265 days shorter. Notice that the one timeline has to do with an agreement which confirms the covenant, while the other apparently has to do with the start of animal sacrifices. The most popular theory is that confirming the covenant has to do with some kind of agreement to rebuild the temple. An agreement that makes the Jews think that the old covenant, or promise, that they would become a great nation has finally come to fruition, and the one with whom they make this agreement is more or less assumed to be their promised Messiah. Rebuilding the entire temple in just 7 or 8 months would be quite a feat, but there are Jewish zealots around today who are prepared to do just that, if they can just get approval to start construction. Construction is hampered at the moment by the fact that the Muslim Dome of the Rock stands on the site of the original temple, and Orthodox Jews believe that their temple must occupy that same site. It may take some kind of radical international agreement, probably initiated and overseen by a world ruler, to get a temple up there without starting a huge war. Now remember, we are guessing here, but it's a pretty educated guess, and it does bring together a lot of the other clues and pieces. The theory is that point A on the chart is an agreement to rebuild the temple. Point B is the resumption of animal sacrifices when the temple is completed and then open to the public. And point C is the start, or possibly the end, of God's wrath being poured out on the earth's inhabitants, after the true followers of Christ have all been taken up to meet Jesus in the New Jerusalem for 45 days of celebrations. Now we're going to move to the 12th and final chapter of Daniel, where he gives two other unique periods of time from which we get the period of 45 days that I just mentioned. The Revelation makes numerous mentions of 1,260 days, or 3.5 years, for the second half of the last 7 years. However, in Daniel 12, verses 11 and 12, at the very end of his prophecies, he says that there will be 1,290 days remaining until the end, if you count from the time that the sacrifices actually cease and the abomination is set up in the temple. We've already been told that this abomination of desolation happens in the midst of the last 7 years, but not necessarily in the exact middle. This period of 1,290 days from the abomination until the end suggests that the sacrifices cease 30 days before all those other 1,260-day events begin. Kind of a 1-month warning before the start of the Great Tribulation. This helps to make it clear why Jesus said for us to watch for that event. We need to watch for it because it gives us a 30-day warning to get out of there. Daniel adds yet another figure here in these closing verses of his book, and this figure does not appear anywhere else in the Bible. He says, "Blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1,335 days." So here we have a further period of 45 days beyond the start of God's wrath, which I would assume represent just how long both the wrath and the marriage celebrations will take. We have learned in other passages that the wrath of God only begins after the rapture, when all true believers are taken up to meet Jesus in the air, in the New Jerusalem. It can be confusing at times when we hear about Jesus coming down and us going up. But as I said earlier, that's because there is this huge celebration, which is called the marriage supper of the Lamb, up there in the sky, inside an incredibly huge structure, which is 1,000 miles square and 1,000 miles high, referred to as the New Jerusalem. It's during this marriage celebration between Jesus and his bride, or the true church, that God sends his angels to pour out bowls of pure, unadulterated wrath on the world below. So it appears that this period of simultaneous celebration and suffering lasts for 45 days. 45 days of celebration for us, and 45 days of the worst suffering possible for the people still left on earth. This is the only place in the Bible where we have such a figure, 1,335 days. It does seem to be the total length of 30 days before the Great Tribulation begins, 1,260 days of the tribulation itself, and the much worse pouring out of God's wrath after the tribulation, which appears to last for 45 days. Now, the period of time that is most emphasized in prophecy is this period of 1,260 days, or 42 months, which is often described as the time of Great Tribulation. During that time, a number of huge disasters strike the earth, and the Antichrist makes war with all followers of Christ, possibly blaming us for having caused the disasters, since we will know ahead of time that they're coming. Daniel refers to the Antichrist making war with the saints in the 7th chapter of his prophecies, verses 21 to 22. The Antichrist is described as a horn on the head of a beast, a horn that speaks great blasphemies against God. So the beast is the government and the horn is its leader. He says, "I beheld, and the same horn made war with the saints, and prevailed against them, until the Ancient of Days," that's Jesus, "came. And the judgment was given to the saints of the Most High." That's the Battle of Armageddon, which comes at the very end of the wrath and at the very end of the wedding celebrations. And the time came that the saints possessed the kingdom. The same period of time, 1,260 days, is used to describe how long the two witnesses prophesied to the world. These are two men with incredible supernatural powers and protection from God, who repeatedly and dramatically warn the world of God's judgment, at the same time that the Antichrist is slaughtering Christians. This is mentioned in Revelation chapter 11, verse 3. I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. Those Christians who've been listening to God and obeying Jesus up to this point will be miraculously protected during that same period of time. You can read about that in the 12th chapter of the Revelation, where they're described as a woman. The woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Well, that's it. We've drawn together passages from about 10 different chapters in the Bible to show how all of them fit together to give a fairly detailed picture of what to expect leading up to the return of Jesus. At this point in human history, we can still pretty much say what Jesus said when he ascended to heaven. No man knows the day nor the hour when all this will happen. So do not be easily fooled by all those con men who come up with new predictions almost every month here on YouTube, all saying Jesus is just about to return, or the rapture is just about to happen, or the tribulation is just about to begin. I'm not so sure that Jesus himself is still ignorant of when he will return, considering that he's now resumed his full power as God. But the bottom line for now is that we humans are still ignorant. Yet Jesus and other New Testament writers repeatedly tell us to study the signs of the times, and especially to watch for this abomination of desolation. Why? Because, as Paul said to the Thessalonians, you are not in darkness, that that day should overtake you as a thief. See, in the end, every eye shall behold him. Both the good guys and the bad guys will know the day and the hour at the very end. So ignorance about when he will return is not absolute and eternal. It's true that most of the world will be caught by surprise, caught because they did not listen to Jesus and because they did not study the prophecy that Jesus told his followers to study. But like Paul said to the Thessalonians, we are children of the light, not children of darkness. So we will be ready and waiting for Jesus when he returns. So in conclusion, please study this chart. Memorize it, copy it, and put it in your Bible and on your wall. Stay open to the possibility that there may be some details that are still not crystal clear, but at the same time, observe things that are happening in the world, and then line them up with this prophecy. Just as the first 69 weeks of Daniel's 70-week prophecy predicted when the Messiah would be crucified, so the final week will tell us exactly when he will return. Lift up your heads, for the coming of your Lord draws nigh. Amen.